So hello everybody. I'll wait a few more seconds, maybe 2 minutes or something, because people are still dripping in. So, but then in 2 minutes or so we will start. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this session on human biogeography. I'm very happy we have about 70 people registered. That's not everybody who's here, but I think we just start, and because we have a program with 4 very nice speakers. So yeah, welcome again. I know for some people they got up early in the morning, for other people it's late in the evening. Yeah, so today, human biogeography, understanding the distributions of people, cultures, and languages. So human biogeography, what is it? Or maybe what can it be? So human biogeography, it's a discipline in the making. Questions that we could address and people are addressing are where did our ancestors travel and what routes did they follow? So if we want to reconstruct past human migrations, we have to take into account barriers, but not only physical barriers like mountain ranges or oceans, but perhaps also cultural barriers or maybe genetic barriers. So, and yeah, why did people decide to move to a certain place? Why did they decide to settle there and not somewhere else? So this touches upon the role of our environment, how our environment shapes our collective decisions. And yeah, we have to know something about the dynamic role of climate, topography, and ecology, and of course also their interactions. And then finally, so what aspect of the human species, of our own species, are we interested in? Is it our physiology? Yeah, of course, a classic example is lactase tolerance, which is uneven across the globe. Some people can digest milk, and while others have more difficulty with that. So it really shows how our environment shapes our physiology. Also, yeah, numbers or density. So why do people live in high concentrations along the coasts and along rivers? And it's not only about only the species, but also our culture, our languages, and also our genes. So yeah, how are cultures shaped by environmental dynamics? So I think that biogeographers are well equipped to address these kinds of questions. but not alone. And that's why I say interdiscipline, and interdiscipline in the making, because it's inherently a really interdisciplinary endeavor. And we need insights from other disciplines. And I think also, yeah, biogeography also can contribute to that. So then, yeah, biogeography, human biogeography, and friends. So who are these friends? So yeah, recently I have two Bibles. So one is this one. It's Human Biogeography by Alexandra Harcourt, and the other one is of course this one. But yeah, and Harcourt says, okay, human biogeography is at the interface of biogeography and anthropology. But of course, there are many related disciplines that can contribute as well: archaeology, genetics, paleoecology, linguistics, etc., etc. And we will hear some examples of each of these disciplines yeah, in the coming talks. And then John Terrell, he wrote, okay, well, yeah, it might be called human geography, but it often isn't. And that's of course because there are many related disciplines that ask similar questions. And some examples are cultural macroevolution, human macroecology, human phylogeography. So these are all yeah, questions, but maybe I feel that the nuance is slightly different from what human biogeography is or could be. Yeah, a little bit about my own background. How did I become interested in human biogeography? So last year I finished my PhD thesis with the title Island Biogeography in the Anthropocene and Quaternary. And the aim of my thesis was to understand how biodiversity patterns across islands are shaped by human activities and by past environmental dynamics, and how the extent of these yeah, processes relate to each other. So here's an example of the island of Mauritius. It's a small island about 800 kilometers east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. And on the map on the left, you see in light gray shades the extent of the island during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were much lower than they are today, about 135 meters in some places. So in 20,000 years, roughly, the island shrunk from the light gray area to the dark gray area. But in only 400 years of human settlement, the extent of native vegetation that covered nearly the entire island before human settlement was reduced to that small green speck in the southwest of the island. So in the next two slides, I will briefly talk about island biogeography in the Quaternary, and then about island biogeography in the Anthropocene. So in the first step, I reconstructed the extent of islands during these sea levels in the past. For example, here again showing the last glacial maximum, you could walk from Tasmania to New Guinea. The whole Sunda Shelf was exposed. So this yeah, must have had a tremendous impact on biodiversity on these islands. And indeed, I found that for angiosperms and gastropods, that these past archipelago configurations still have an imprint on yeah, patterns of biodiversity today. And then I found out that 2 years before that, there were already some really cool studies by Keeley and O'Connor and Lois, for example. Also, this is in the between Sunda and Sahul, and they made a reconstruction of the intervisibility of islands, also yeah, over the past 10,000s of years, and how this could have affected human migration. So I thought this was a really interesting crossover and also illustration of the similarity of questions that traditionally are asked by biogeographers and what, yeah, and related disciplines. Then another example here about island biogeography in the Anthropocene. For 30 islands in the Eastern Atlantic, I assessed to what extent their present-day native vegetation cover is affected by environmental conditions like climate and topography on the one hand, but also socioeconomic factors, and for example, population density or land use patterns. And I found that across all these islands, topography or ruggedness in particular was really strongly correlated with the extent of native vegetation that was remaining on these islands. And to me, this really suggested really how easy it is for people to transgress a landscape, also affect the extent to which people do modify a landscape to suit their needs. So really, it's not only about how people modify their environment, but also it's really interactive process. It's also how our environment, drives us and affects how we can and will change the living world around us. So it's a two-way process, and I think this is also in human biogeography, both ways. So, and then last year I moved from the ecology department to the linguistics department. First I was studying species distributions on islands, and now I'm focused on languages in South America. And of course, South America is interesting because it's except for Antarctica, of course, but it's the last continent to be settled by humans, by people. But it has a tremendous linguistic diversity. So many languages that you see there, you don't find a close relative somewhere else. So they are like the endemic species of languages, you could say. These are called isolated languages. And in interdisciplinary team, together with geneticists, archaeologists, and linguists, we're trying to understand why this is the case, and we're trying to reconstruct the population history of South America. And again, I think this is another illustration from my own experience. I think that shows what biogeography can bring, and also how biogeographers can learn from other disciplines. And I think that's the most joyful. That's why I personally love science, is because you learn every day. And if you're in a slightly out of comfort discipline, then you learn the most. So then it's most fun, I think. So that's why we have four fascinating speakers today. I will introduce them to you now. So first we have Marco Coelho. He will talk about drivers of geographic patterns of North American language diversity. And if I'm correct, he's also a biogeographer by training. Then Fernando Racimo from the University of Copenhagen. He will talk about ancient genomics and biogeography, what DNA can tell us about the spatial movement of humans during the European Holocene. Then we have John Edward Terrell. He will talk about Ptolemy, Copernicus, and human biogeography, common sense versus the science of human diversity. And finally, we have Stefani Crabtree, who will talk about how landscape rules predict optimal superhighways for the first peopling of the Sahul. So just as Humboldt, today is Humboldt Day, who traveled widely and looked broadly. Today we also have talks about different regions of the world and people with different perspectives and disciplinary backgrounds. So without further ado, I will give the word to Marco. For each talk we have about 20 minutes. And then we have 5 minutes for changing the presentations, but also for questions, if you have them, or suggestions. So give him a warm applause. Marco, can you share your screen?
Yes.
I see already some virtual applauses. Great.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. And today I want to show you part of the research that I've been developing with an interdisciplinary research group interested in understanding spatial patterns of language diversity. More specifically, I'm going to talk about the drivers of geographic patterns of North American language diversity. So our study highlights new approaches for examining two fundamental facts about human diversity that demand explanation. Why do humans speak so many languages, and why are these languages so unevenly distributed across the world? So surprisingly, we still know little about the complex web of factors that shape these geographic patterns of language diversity. And one barrier to our prior understanding has been the contradictory results found in the limited number of empirical studies that have tried to confront environmental and social cultural variables with language diversity. Just to show you one example of contradictory results. So mountains are hypothesized to affect the isolation among human population, decreasing the contact among human groups. So it is expected, because of this decrease in context among human groups, we would observe more languages in mountainous regions across the world. And the empirical studies trying to test the effect of isolation on language diversity usually test the statistical association between topography and language diversity, but the results varies a lot. So, for example, one study showed a negative correlation between language diversity and topography for West African languages. Another study showed weak correlation between topography and language diversity at global scale. And another study showed that topography can be an important correlate of language diversity in different continents. So the same types of inconsistencies emerges when other environmental or social cultural variables are confronted against language diversity. And there are two methodological challenges that contributes to the emergence of these inconsistencies in the results. One of them is our quest for universal predictors of language diversity. So previous studies have tried to identify a single predictor that could explain language diversity everywhere, but it's pretty reasonable to assume that the predictors of language diversity can vary across the world or even within different regions. Also, the other challenge is the complexity of the pattern being studied. So language diversity is a product of a complex web of factors, including direct and indirect pathway linking multiple predictors with language diversity. So we overcome these prior methodological limitations by designing a path analysis model that includes the direct and indirect effect of variables on language diversity, but also that assumes that the effect of each variable can vary across space. So, oops, sorry. Don't know what I did here. Okay. So, as predictor variable of our model, we have language diversity. And what I'm referring here as language diversity is what is commonly known in biodiversity literature as alpha diversity. So the number of languages within a given region. So here in this map, we can see geographical ranges of indigenous languages in North America. And we can overlay a gridded map over these geographical ranges and count the number of languages within each grid cell like we commonly do in biogeography. So if we do that, we have an empirical spatial pattern to study. So North America provides an ideal setting to test how the effect of each variable varies across space because it provides a wide range of environmental conditions, as well as a wide spectrum of language diversity across space. And previous studies have proposed a series of hypotheses to explain this geographic pattern of language diversity. So based on this previous hypothesis, we used river density and topographic complexity to represent the effect of isolation on language diversity. So it is hypothesized that both variables can act as barrier to human contact and thus influence language diversification over time. We also used ecoregion richness as a measure of resource partitioning for languages. So it is hypothesized that the development of unique subsistence strategies and technologies may allow different human groups to thrive within different ecoregions. So we should expect more language diversity in locations with more ecoregions. We used 3 different variables to represent the effect of climate on language diversity. So it is hypothesized that locations with higher climatic fluctuation can affect the establishment of human groups as well as the production of food. So, for example, it is assumed that locations with higher climatic, in locations with higher climatic fluctuations, human groups would need to cooperate to survive. And because of these cooperations, the groups need in some way to communicate to each other. And it is hypothesized that in locations with huge climatic fluctuations, we should observe less language diversity, or at least minor accumulation of language diversity over time. So we used climate change velocity as a measure of how fast did climate change in each location, precipitation and temperature constancy as a measure of how constant has been precipitation and temperature in each location. We also used an estimation of population density for hunters and gatherers populations in North America. So there are multiple hypotheses linking population density with language diversity. But for example, one idea is that in larger populations, in really dense locations, usually we observe higher innovation rates in language. So over time, you should expect higher accumulation of languages in denser locations. We also use the carrying capacity with group size limits that here represents the predictions of a simulation model. So the simplifying, the idea is that locations that can support more human individuals can also support more human groups and therefore can support more languages. So we assume that each of these variables directly affect language diversity, like it's commonly done in previous studies, but some of these variables affect the availability of resources for human populations. So some of these variables can indirectly affect language diversity through their effect in population density. So what do we find when we assume this model? So in this particular model, the effect of each variable is uniform across space. And in this case, we can see that ecoregion richness, population density, and carrying capacity have the highest direct coefficients affecting language diversity. Just to show you an example of how important it is to look to the indirect effects, I'm going to pick topographic complexity here. So if we only looked to the direct effect of topographic complexity on language diversity, we will conclude that it has a negative and very weak association with language diversity in North America. But when we look to the indirect effects, topographic complexity positively affects population density, that positively affects language diversity. So the indirect effect is positive and stronger than the direct effect. But assuming this model, this complete model, the fit of the model, so we can explain around 50% of the variation in language diversity in North America. But in this particular model, we are assuming that the effect of each variable is uniform across space, and there's no reason for that. So when we assume a geographically weighted path analysis, we can see now that the effect of each variable can be represented by a mean effect and a standard deviation. I'm going to pick up topographic complexity here as an example again. So the mean direct effect of topographic complexity on language diversity is represented by 0.10, but the standard deviation is 0.24, so positive or negative, which means that the effect of topographic complexity on language diversity can be negative or positive, depending on where we're looking in space. The same thing applies for the fit of the model. So this model explains an average of 61% of the variation in language diversity in North America, but it also varies. And if it varies, it means that we can map it. So this is a map of R² in North America, in which you can see these warmer regions in red, in which the model explains more than 50% of the variation in language diversity. And we can also see, so in these warmer regions, the fit of the model can reach even 86% of the variation explained in language diversity. But we can also see these very clear regions in green, in which the model explains less than 50% of the variation in language diversity. And for these particular reasons, for these particular regions, we came up with two possible explanations for why this model has a poor performance in this area. One possible reason is that we know that these regions, the human groups were characterized by obtaining resources by a higher frequency of hunting of larger mammals, which is a dimension of obtention of resources that is completely absent from this model. Also, this region is characterized by the highest annual flow of water in rivers in North America. So although we include river density in our model, river density actually do not capture this information about annual flow. And these locations could, instead of act as isolation between human populations, it could in fact increase their social networks because humans could easily use these rivers for transportation. And another interesting thing is that we can map the variables that have the highest total coefficient on language diversity in North America. So total coefficient here is represented by the sum of their direct and indirect effects. And because we can see different colors in this map means that different variables are the most important variables explaining language diversity in different regions of North America. Of course, we can see, for example, population density in gray, that is the variable with the highest total coefficient in a larger proportion of the territory of North America, but we can see that it varies a lot. So this study actually led us to continue study language diverse patterns, specifically because of the predictions of a simulation model that we use in this particular study. So this carrying capacity with group size limits represents the predictions of a simulation model that we previously developed to study Australian language diversity. And we were really surprised to see with this particular path analysis that the predictions for North American language diversity is not good when compared to the predictions that we had before for Australian language diversity. So based on that, and based on what we learned in this particular study, we started developing a new mechanistic simulation model to better understand the diversification of languages. So contrary to correlative models, simulation models allow us to perform virtual experiments in which we control the rules of these virtual realities. So we can include the verbal models that have been discussed by linguists over decades and see if these proposed mechanisms can generate empirical patterns that we observe in nature. So in this particular model, population density is defined by environment and social constraints, and groups, human groups, is spread over space until they reach a maximum group size. So languages start splitting when groups reach a maximum group size, but over time, human populations are subject to what we are calling population shocks that could be positive or negative and increase or decrease their population over time. So for example, group shock could represent, but is not limited to, the development of new subsistence strategies, such as agriculture, that would allow groups to spread or even conquer their neighbors, or even internal turmoils that could lead populations to decrease. Regional shocks would represent environmental events such as drought that could affect the populations occurring in a given region, or warfare, or even the emergence of a disease that could affect all the populations in a given region. So when we compare the predictions of this model with what is observed in North America, this model can predict around 63% of the variation of language diversity in North America, and it supports ideas related to how environment, how social constraints, demographic events, or even negative events such as war and disease can leave imprints into the distribution of human populations that could explain the patterns that we observe for language diversity. So this particular study is not peer-reviewed yet, but it's available as a preprint. So if you want to give us a friendly review, I would appreciate a lot. So based on it, just to finish the talk here, what I showed to you is that the strongest effect on North American language diversity involves variables based on previously developed hypotheses about climate, how climate and demographic variables affect language diversity. The ecological drivers of language diversity is neither perfectly universal nor entirely direct. And the combination of path analysis techniques with geographically weighted regressions can help us to better understand the underlying drivers of our own cultural and linguistic diversity. So these studies were developed in collaboration with these amazing people spread around the world, especially in a collaboration with my friend Mike Gavin from Colorado State University. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Marco. Great talk. Also, very nice to see your new work. It just looks really fascinating. So we have one question in the chat.
Okay.
I can read it. So Marco, thanks for your talk. Are your estimates of population density based on modern estimates? And how does this relate to changes in population density through time?
So this specific estimation for population density is available for hunters and gatherers populations. So populations of 15,000 years or even before. And they are not based on current estimates. So they take into consideration a lot of things. So distance to coast, for example, topography, and even the diversity of species. And these models are tested against the population density, that the data of population density that we have available for hunters and gatherers populations. So it's a good model. It's published. The first author name is Patrick Cavena. It's in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. I don't remember the title of the paper, but it's an estimate for hunters and gatherers. So it's not based on current estimates.
Great. Are there any other questions? Feel free to start. Here's a question. Are the distribution of languages based on their current distribution or on historical pre-European distribution?
It's only based on the historical distribution, their pre-colonial context.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe I also was curious. So whether you explored whether the grid cell size that you used also affected the results, because I can imagine that if you have large, like a language that has a wide range, and you put a grid cell on it, then by definition the diversity will be one. So how did you take that into account?
Yeah, so that's we test the sensitivity for many resolutions to see, but for us that is used in with macroecology and biogeography, it's really different because the ranges of languages do not overlap like the ranges of species. And because of that, we see exactly what you say. So if you have very small grid cells in the geographic domain, then you see lower variation of language diversity. So most of the diversity calculated for each cell will be 1. Mm-hmm. But we found that around 3 degrees of resolution, we can have a better variation in language diversity across space. But anyway, we still test if the results changes when we go up or down in the resolution. Mm-hmm. So we test the sensitivity.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and then in the chat there's a question about you say ranges of languages do not overlap, but sometimes they might overlap.
For current languages, that's true. For pre-colonial languages, when we observe that in the map, you see a blob within another language range. So even for current languages, it's common for big cities like São Paulo, New York, you'll see dozens of languages spoken at the same time. But when we look to the pre-colonial languages, there are specific regions in the world that are known for having multiple languages co-occurring. But what we observe in the language maps is that if there is a co-occurrence, you usually see a unique blob within a language range.
Okay, thanks a lot. So yeah, the next talk is by Fernando, but there's room for another question if there's someone has. And
so John is asking why the pre-colonial languages do not overlap. What I'm saying is that they probably overlap. We see regions with that is multilingualistic. I don't remember the correct term for that. But for the language ranges that we get from Atlas of Language Distribution or ranges that are produced by experts of languages in different regions, each linguistic range is represented without overlapping with each other. Yeah, language maps have problems like species maps have too. So
yeah. Okay. Okay, here's the last question, and then meanwhile maybe Fernando can start sharing the screen. So how do analysis look if you take into account language family diversity?
I actually never tested language diversity in another level, but that's for sure something interesting to look at and see if it changes. I really don't know that.
Okay. Okay. Hey, Marco, thanks again for your fascinating talk. Really nice. And yeah, thanks for your time.
Yeah.
So yeah, give him again a warm applause. In the meanwhile, the next speaker is Fernando Racimo. He will talk about ancient genomics and biogeography, and he will tell us what DNA can tell us about the spatial movement of humans during the European Holocene. So from North America, we move to Europe. Okay, the floor is yours, Fernando.
Thank you, Sietze. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for the invitation, and also thanks, Marco, for a really very super interesting talk. Yeah, so as Sietze said, I'll be talking to you about what ancient genomics can tell us about biogeography, particularly in Western Eurasia during the Holocene. I should say, a priori, I'm not a geographer, I'm a genomicist, but hopefully there's going to be some nice points of intersection. So I'm an associate professor. I'm based at the Globe Institute in the University of Copenhagen, where I have a research group at the Geogenetics Center. We work on questions related to evolutionary genomics and population genetics, particularly studying ancient genomes to try to understand what ancient genomes can tell us about the movement of people in the past, as well as natural selection and mixture processes. Let me see if I can. Yeah, so the motivation for my talk today is it's sort of a really nice time to be alive in the population genomics field, but for two reasons. One is that there's been some really nice developments in terms of theory, particularly in terms of theory for understanding how different genomes across the world from different individuals living in different points in time and space are related to each other, and how we can reconstruct sort of the genealogies linking those different genomes in time and space. And at the same time, there's really an amazing explosion of ancient DNA that has occurred in the past 10 years. There's now over 2,000 ancient human genomic sequences that are publicly available, as well as hundreds of ancient non-human genomes as well. So it's really a nice time to work at the intersection of this amazing data research and this amazing method development. So I'm interested in understanding how we can model genetic processes over space and time, and how we can link genomes to interesting questions about human mobility. Just to make it clear how we can link sort of genomic information with information about space and time, I'd just like to start with this very basic example of my genome. So let's imagine I just have two chromosomes, so a single pair of chromosomes. And if I were to like sort of miniaturize myself and paint my genome, I could paint one of my chromosomes blue, representing the fact that it comes from my dad, and the other chromosome red, representing the fact that it comes from my mom. That would be a pretty trivial exercise, but I can do that with my parents. I could also do that for my grandparents or my great-grandparents, right? So I could take my genome and paint the parts of my genome that I can trace back to a particular great-grandfather from either my paternal or my maternal lineage. And if I were to paint my ancestral genomes, depending on which country they came from, let's say Italy and Spain, because most of my ancestors come from either Italy or Spain, if I go a few generations back into the past, then what I would get when I look at my own genome would be sort of a mosaic of blue and red. And the reason for that is that at each generation, there's a reshuffling of the chromosomes that happens because of a process known as recombination that happens at every generation. So what I get at the end of this process is sort of like a mosaic of all the different chromosomes that I could trace back to my great-grandparents. And I'm coloring my great-grandparents based on their nationalities, but that's a very arbitrary painting that I'm choosing. I could have also chosen to paint my grandparents depending on whether they live north or south of a particular latitude, or east or west of a particular longitude. But here I'm doing it in a very simplified way. Now, this exercise of painting one's genomes, depending on where they can be traced from, is a common exercise in population genomics. There's a lot of tools that allow us to paint an individual's genomes by tracing which parts of a genome can be traced to particular ancestors. And when we don't have the ancestral genome, so I can't disinter my great-grandparents and sequence them and obtain their genomes, what one does is one looks at sort of what are called population reference panels, individuals that have been living in Spain or Italy and whose ancestors have also been living in Spain or Italy or other countries, and can be used as sort of proxies for the actual ancestors that I have. So here's an example where somebody took a bunch of Latin American genomes from different Latin American countries and painted each of these different genomes from different individuals, depending on whether they could trace their ancestors back to some Native American population, some European population, or some African population. So here red means Native American, European means yellow, and African means blue. And so you can see that different Latin American individuals, here represented by each of these different columns, have different amounts of ancestry tracing back to either Native American individuals, European individuals, or African individuals. And you can see, for example, that individuals from Peru tend to have more Native American ancestry than individuals from Puerto Rico. Now we can do this with Latin Americans, but we can also do this with Europeans. If you go far enough back into the past, you can model any human population as a mixture of other populations. It's really a mixture all the way back. So in the case of Europeans, there have been these two major movements of people that occurred during the Holocene. One of them was a very well-known population movement that's called the Neolithic, which brought agricultural practices into Europe. If you were to take a time machine, so 10,000 years into the past, to most places in Europe, you would find that those places are occupied by isolated groups of hunter-gatherers, and genetics people like to sort of differentiated as two main groups of hunter-gatherers that lived in Europe 10,000 years ago, that are called the Western hunter-gatherers and the Eastern hunter-gatherers. And at some point, starting at about 9,000 to 8,000 years ago, we see a massive movement of people from Anatolia into Europe. And these are the people that brought agriculture into Europe. And later on during the Bronze Age, we also see a massive movement of people from the Eurasian steppe into Europe, likely bringing in pastoral practices like steppe herding into the continents. These two large expansions of people really changed the genomic makeup of the European continent over time. And again, making a very strong simplification, one can take any present-day European genome today, so my genome or Sietze's genome, and we can sort of partition which parts of an individual's genomes can be traced to either these sort of original hunter-gatherer groups or the Neolithic peoples that came into Europe during the Neolithic, or these other steppe peoples that came into Europe during the Bronze Age. Now, different individuals from different parts of Europe will have more or less fractions of these different sources, but almost everybody in Europe today has some ancestry from these three different ancestral populations. Now, one thing that one does, so this exercise of sort of tracing ancestry back in time to particular reference populations, as I said, it's a very popular methodology in population genomics. And what does is you run your favorite method for performing this, what is called ancestry inference or latent ancestry inference. Then you look at a map, and then you start drawing arrows on the map. Because you might see that, perhaps, for example, an individual that lived maybe 1,000 years ago has more Neolithic ancestry than an individual that lived 5,000 years ago. So you posit there must be an arrow going from Anatolia into Europe at some point. Now, this practice of drawing arrows on a map is very much frowned upon by archaeologists and anthropologists that we talk to very often. It's quite widespread in population genomics, but it has a lot of problems. And I'm sure if I presented this to a geographer, they would probably not be very happy either, because arrows can be ambiguous. Sometimes they can represent displacements of people. Sometimes they can represent expansions of people. They're not very good at reflecting the speed at which a movement process occurred. They're very poor at reflecting the spatial extent of a movement, and sometimes they run the risk of overinterpretation. Somebody from a different field that is not familiar with the particular techniques that are used in a particular field to sort of create those arrows might misinterpret what the original person was trying to say. And so after talking with archaeologists and anthropologists who studied the history of Western Eurasia for many more decades than I have studied this, we started thinking about how can we better improve the way we sort of trace and visualize the changes in ancestry that happened over time and space in Europe during the Holocene. And so we published a paper a couple of years ago where we borrowed a technique that is quite widespread in sort of environmental statistics. It's based on spatiotemporal Gaussian processes to provide better visualizations of how we think these expansions or movements of people happened over time and space. I'm not going to go into detail into the sort of the details of this methodology. I just want to show you the results that came up from this. What we did is we took the over 1,000 ancient human genomes that are available from Western Eurasia. Most of these are from the last 10,000 years, but there's a few more from the last 50,000 years as well. And we applied this spatiotemporal Gaussian process methodology on the ancestry inference method that I talked about before. And what we obtain is sort of a dynamic representation of how population expansions or population contractions happened over time. So here's an example of, for example, the Neolithic expansion, this massive movement of people from Anatolia into Europe, occurring at different rates in different parts of Europe. In some places staggering for several hundreds of years, particularly, for example, in Scandinavia. It took a while for this ancestry to sip in all the way up to the north. But you can see that this is a much more informative visualization of how we think these processes happening, rather than just drawing arrows on a map. Now, the cool thing is that this sort of representation is entirely based on information that we can get from genomes, but there's an alternative source of data here, which is we can talk to archaeologists, and archaeologists can tell us when are the sort of the first spots on a map where we first see evidence for agricultural practices in Europe. And so there's a lot of archaeometric maps made about the expansion of agricultural practices rather than agricultural associated ancestry into Europe over time. And we can compare these maps and start to see whether there's differences or similarities between these two maps, which are to some degree representing a sort of linked process. It's either movement of genes as a consequence of this expansion versus movement of technologies. But at the same time, they're not the same process, right? There's contrast that can be made between these two things that can reveal a lot more about how ideas were being carried into different areas of Europe. In addition to that, we can look at some of the other ancestries for which we have genomic information. So I mentioned this other population of hunter-gatherers that existed in Europe during the Holocene, the Western hunter-gatherers. And we can make dynamic maps of how we think this ancestry over time decreased as new populations were going into Europe, the Neolithic peoples, as well as other peoples that came into Europe later on, to the point that this ancestry in present-day Europeans is at much lower proportions than what was the case 10,000 years ago. So you sort of see a contraction of this ancestry over time. We can also look at other populations of hunter-gatherers. There's this other group of hunter-gatherers that were called the Eastern hunter-gatherers that were mostly concentrated in Northeastern Europe at the beginning of the Holocene. But later on, as a consequence of these large-scale steppe migrations during the Bronze Age, started expanding into Europe. This through what are called the corded ware culture in Northern Europe in particular. And so this sort of technique provides very fine-scale maps of spatiotemporal movements of people that we can infer from genomic data over time and space. In addition to this, we also have really fine-scale reconstructions of vegetation during the same period, the Holocene in Europe. We know whether particular types of vegetation, like particular types of forest or pasture or arable land, were present in Europe as a consequence of changes in climate, but also changes in human occupancy that occurred at different points in time and space. And so we collaborated with a group of experts in paleovegetation reconstructions to try to see whether we could find any links between changes in vegetation on one hand and changes in movements of people that we can infer from genomic data. And so we developed a hierarchical Bayesian model for trying to see whether we could explain the presence or absence of particular vegetation types as a consequence of the incursion of particular peoples into Europe, as well while controlling for changes in climatic variables like temperature changes or precipitation changes, and also accounting for the fact that all of these variables are to some extent autocorrelated in space and time. And so the result of this is we found that, for example, the steppe ancestry, this movements of people that came into Europe during the Bronze Age, was negatively associated with particular types of pasture, positively associated with particular types of pasture, but negatively associated with particular types of forest. And about the reverse happened with hunter-gatherers, which were positively associated with those forest types, which could indicate that this Bronze Age movement of people may have led to the decrease of some of the forest types, particularly the ones that were found at more southern latitudes in Europe. And this, I mean, sort of an interpretation of this could be that people were creating more space for like pastoral lifestyles or perhaps more agricultural lifestyles than what the hunter-gatherer groups were living on. Okay, so that is sort of a little bit of what we can do with genomes in terms of inferring movements of people over time. We can also take ancient genomes and trace the movement of particular mutations in our genomes as they expanded or contracted over time and space. And so you can imagine, for example, there's many mutations that occur at each generation in human populations. Sietze mentioned one of them, the lactase persistence mutation that confers the ability to digest lactose well into adulthood, in particular human populations. If a particular mutation is beneficial, there's a high probability that it might start to expand. And so we might see that its frequency starts to rise over time, and eventually it might be highly frequent over a large area of space. And ideally, we'd like to reconstruct this expansion of the range of a beneficial mutation as it expands, using imperfect observations that come from the individual genomes that we can sample from different periods and different parts of the continents. And so this is work by one of my, can you see, is there, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm, yeah. This is work by one of my students, Rasa. She's been developing a method to reconstruct the way in which an allele has expanded over time and space, using a spatiotemporal reaction advection diffusion equation and a model that is particularly tailored for dealing with ancient genomes, which tend to be degraded. And so one needs to take into account the fact that the data we might obtain might not be the most reliable data that we could obtain if we just were to sequence a present-day human individual. And here you can see a sort of simulation of a particular beneficial mutation expanding over space and time, and Rasa's inference, which really corresponds very well to the simulation. We applied her method to the lactose persistence allele, so I'm glad that Sietze mentioned it before. There's a lot of data for this allele. There's a lot of ancient genomes sampled over the last 10,000 years, and for each of these genomes, we can determine whether an individual had the mutation or did not have the mutation. And based on this sort of imperfect observations, we can reconstruct the expansion of this allele over time. And we can trace where is the most likely place for this mutation to have originated. In this particular case, we think it's probably somewhere in the eastern part of Europe, maybe when their eastern hunter-gatherer peoples were living. So this mutation did not come from the Neolithic peoples, but it did expand over time as the Neolithic process was underway. Another interesting thing is that the center of mass of the allele frequency of this mutation sort of moves west. So today, most of the high frequency areas of the map, so the places where you're most likely to find this mutation, are further west than where we infer the initial origin of this mutation to be. We can also infer the strength of selection operating on this variant, which, as many studies have seen before, is quite strong. How am I doing with time? Yeah. Okay, the last thing I want to mention is, I've presented all these different types of inference frameworks, but we also want to create methods to benchmark these methods and devise ways to simulate data in interesting ways and make sure that whatever inference method or mechanism we are generating actually is valid, is actually doing what we expect it to do. The problem is that in the sort of genomics field, there's some very, very advanced ways of simulating genomes, including many interesting features like selection and admixture and different types of genomic elements. But most of the genomic simulators out in the wild, to some degree, ignore geography or treat geography as a nuisance or have very simple models of spatial dispersal. And so one usually treats populations as if they were tubes that divide and then remerge into new tubes. Which is where space has no sort of effect on the simulation. And this is problematic because space really affects the way in which alleles are distributed over different areas in a map. And as we've seen, geography is really intrinsic to the way in which we think about our past. So a postdoc in our group, Martin, he's been developing an R package to quickly building programmatically informed spatiotemporal genomic models. So he's developed all these really nice R features for creating a population that has a spatial existence in a map and saying, well, I want this population to exist here, but then I want this population to expand into a particular area or move into a particular area. And this can be done very easily with a few lines of R code. And the outcome of this is that you get all the genomes that may have existed during your simulation. So you can actually look at the genetic variation that resulted from whatever spatiotemporal scenario you want to put your individuals through. So here's an example where he creates a particular population that has, this is just a toy example, but this population has these particular boundaries. He's specifying this population has a certain size, it starts existing at a particular time and is descended from some other population. And by just adding a few more lines of our code, he's specifying that he wants this population to move from here into here. And our package sort of deals with all the complexities that come with geography, like he's sort of making sure that the population doesn't move over the water and sort of behaves the way one would expect. It also has other features, for example, simulating population expansions, not just movement. And so here's a toy simulation of full spatiotemporal dynamics in Western Eurasia. This is not exactly how we think Western Eurasian populations mix, but it's just an example of how all the different things we can do with individual genomic simulations. So each of these individual dots is an individual that has a genome. So you could actually query the genome of that particular individual and look at its entire, all the mutations that particular individual has. And this package also has a whole suite of spatiotemporal models, not just the one I showed you, but also a lot of sort of what are called isolation by distance or DMIC models, as well as different models of dispersal, reproductive isolation, mating, competition between different individuals. And there's a link in the bottom of the slide if you want to give it a try. We're looking for people to test it out. And yeah, in terms of future directions, our group is really moving into sort of delving into all the cool things that genomes can tell us about geographic movement and dispersal and mobility. We're really interested in trying to find ecological or environmental drivers that may have affected mobility in the past, and sort of related to what Marco was saying, really combining different types of data, in our case, genomic and non-genomic data. So trying to really look at the interface between the information that genomes can tell us, but with also what isotope data can tell us, what vegetation can tell us, what linguistics can tell us, but also accounting for the fact that all of this data has some autocorrelation in space and time. So I'd like to thank a bunch of different people, particularly Martin Rassa, who did a lot of the work that I presented, as well as different sources of funding and hosting institutions. And the last thing I want to mention is that if you were interested in some of the topics that I mentioned here, I have 2 positions dealing exactly with this, sort of how we can devise new models for combining genomic, archaeological, environmental, or linguistic data in a spatiotemporal framework. And so if you're interested, feel free to email me in the email that I put below the slide. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot, Fernando. Great, really nice talk and great overview also of the field of genomics. Yeah, I learned a lot. Are there some questions? You can put it in the chat or just unmute your microphone. Okay, so I do have a question. So I was thinking, so those simulations that you showed in the beginning based on these ancient genomes. So and you mentioned these spatiotemporal Gaussian processes. But for example, how would you, or maybe you already are doing that, but how would you, for example, how would you test, for example, what happens if people move mainly alongside rivers, for example? Because I know with this agricultural expansion into Europe, I feel, okay, people follow the coast, people follow the river. So did you already include that, or do you know how to do that?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really, really good point. I mean, and sort of a general question about how we can better incorporate geographic features into this inference. So in the first part of the talk that I presented, we mostly let the data speak by itself. And I'm not sure we have enough resolution now with the number of ancient genomes we have to test whether the individuals were following rivers or not. Maybe since that particular study, it could be possible that it's just the data keeps growing. But yeah, no, we didn't account for sort of how geographic features could inform on the movement. And that's a really important thing to do. To some degree, at some point, I think the sort of the Gaussian process approach probably loses sort of power, and we're mostly moving now towards more simulation-based inference, like the ones I showed, using some of the simulations I showed at the end, perhaps in a some sort of ABC framework where we test different types of paths through the landscape, including things like mountains or rivers. But yeah, that's definitely something we want to incorporate.
Cool. So maybe in the meanwhile, the next speaker, John Terrell, can already start sharing his screen. If there's one brief question still possible, and otherwise maybe because of the time we move on. So thanks again. Give Fernando again a warm virtual applause. Thanks, and I will introduce the next speaker, John Terrell. He will talk about Ptolemy, Copernicus, and human biogeography. Common sense versus the science of human diversity. Wow, it's a great title. So please welcome, John. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay. This is the test screen. I realized when I was putting together this PowerPoint that it had 39 slides. And one of my absolute most favorite movies, if I can get this, is Alfred Hitchcock's The 39 Steps. So if you count through, you'll know how far we are in this presentation. Odd title, perhaps. It's absolutely fascinating to my age. I'm 79 to see this kind of meeting happening. This is wonderful. But anyway, let's get started. When I bring up Ptolemy, what I'm really talking about is how difficult it is for human beings to sort of not see what common sense tells us we see. We all know that it wasn't just Ptolemy who worked on the mathematics of predicting where certain planets in particular or the seasons would happen, and came up with extraordinarily elaborate models of the world, of the universe, which actually were very, very accurate. And that's one of my cautions, is that it's very easy, even if challenging, to develop mathematical models that look like they're telling us the truth, do work, and yet aren't right. And we all know that in this case, it wasn't just Ptolemy who believed that the Earth was at the center of it all. And it took Copernicus and others, and a few Greeks before that and so forth, to challenge that notion. But we also know that even Copernicus's model of the concentric spheres with the Earth at the center of it all, or more or less at the center of it all, wasn't a very accurate model. And it really took Kepler to come along and improve the accuracy of the model. And I think that's an important distinction. Models can be precise, but they're not necessarily accurate. And a distinction that's often made is whether it's an accurate description of the real world or simply a precise calculation that sort of looks like it fits the real world. And this, for an anthropologist, is a particularly worrisome issue, because we all know that the issue of racial diversity is still very much a problem in the United States and indeed around the world. So having not just a very precise understanding of human biological diversity, but also an accurate one has great social, political, and economic implications. This is not just an academic pursuit. We also know that when we sort of use common sense, a generation or so ago, it was okay to title a book Mankind Evolving. I don't have to tell you nowadays that there are a lot of people who object to automatically being put in that kind of category as male or female. So one of the distinctions my colleagues and I are making is to try to focus on and use the distinction between categorical thinking and relational thinking. Categorical thinking is fairly easy for the human brain to do. In fact, we could even say the brain is evolved to be categorical, because a category doesn't have to pay attention to all the nuance. As I like to say, if it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's okay to accept it as a duck, even if it isn't a duck. So again, we're talking about precise versus accurate. And I like this alternative to the idea that somehow I'm not male or I'm not female, from no less than James Baldwin, where I think these have been great talks, by the way, where we're seeing that there are a lot of, I don't call them variables, I call them contingencies, because I want to emphasize that they're not just possible components of an explanation, but that they have to be spelled out, what a difference they might make, how contingent the outcome would be on a particular variable. So I like to call them contingencies rather than variables, partly also because variables once again sort of reflect back to the idea that all models need to be mathematical, which I do not believe in. But biogeography has long been a passion of mine. And so has Charles Darwin. I am very much a Darwinian. But even Darwin realized that this kind of diagram for species diversity had a lot of earliest assumptions built into it that really weren't right. And we won't talk about that, but we all know that this is sort of a nice model, a reasonable model, but not a very accurate model. And then we look at biogeography, and we do indeed see that the world is quite diverse. And it's easy, because of the diversity of species, to also see that, well, we must be the same thing. And forget the fact that unless you believe in racist doctrines, we actually are all one species, and all we're looking at in our own kind is variation on what we can be, not species variation. So it reflects back to Charles Darwin again, and his struggle to sort of talk about what is a species and how do species evolve, sort of mushes over a bit the problem of, what is a species and how long is a species in time and space. And we've got, therefore, as a result, I think a lot of people who use mathematical models, in this case, a linguistics model based on phylogenetic or cladistic analysis, and come up with what look like very precise characterizations of the history of language. However, if you really look at what's being involved, I like to give them this approach to mathematics, what I've started to call the Ptolemy Tin Hat Award. It looks precise, it looks very good, it certainly is mathematical, and it looks wonderful, but if you really then focus down on the details, you realize it falls apart. And that's one of the things about the last speaker I particularly liked. My own fielding is trying to trace the history of groups of people using ancient DNA is almost doomed to failure, because genes are not people and genes can move on their own. But instead focusing on particular alleles, particular traits, and seeing what each trait that you're looking at can tell you, then gives you a number of possible answers to a common question, provided you've modeled it well and you have the biogeographical contingencies well defined. That gives you a way of sort of saying, well, this allele and that, they're beginning to sort of coalesce on an answer, or maybe they're not, or maybe they're actually in conflict. So if I had any response to the last speaker, it's great work, but I think the future lies in looking at particular genetic traits. And by the same token, and that's really what I'm talking about here, this is a very precise and very sort of wonderful and very colorful way of talking about human genetic diversity. But when we talk about human genetic diversity this way, we always use the word admixture. Admixture of what? And it's then we find people talking about, oh, it's about the admixture of populations. So there's a lot of built-in assumptions about what it is you're even sort of talking about. It's why do we talk about sex as a form of admixture? Because we assume that their world is peopled by populations, and that once or ever so often under certain conditions, they might get together and admix. And then if you're talking about really significant human differences, you start talking about introgression. But it's the same problem of, are you in fact, do you have the entities to do this in the real world? So this also, in my book, gets what I call the Ptolemy Tin Hat Award. And it sort of goes down to that distinction I was trying to make between categorical and relational thinking. Common sense, the way the human brain has evolved, encourages us to see the world as separate things which may or may not eventually get connected. But that's not really the way the world works. At least I don't think so. I think this is a better map of what the world works. Things are not always connected exactly in the same ways or to the same degree, but it's really hard not to see when you really get down and focus on the details that there's a lot more connectivity than we've assumed in this sort of right-hand model. Now, this isn't really something that I got from quantum physics and so forth, but it is the same kind of feeling about what's real that comes down to this distinction. Categorical thinking thinks that things exist, and then for reasons that we can go after, may become connected, while relational thinking basically says that what something is not just what it is, but a product of how it is connected with something else. And this really began when I was a graduate student many years ago on the island of Bougainville, which if you want to talk about linguistic diversity in the world, I think you might have seen that earlier, Matt. Papua New Guinea is, in some measures, the most linguistically diverse place on Earth, and it's also environmentally incredibly diverse. And this is my research area. I did my PhD dissertation years ago on the island of Bougainville, which is in the circle, which has, according to linguists, 20 different languages and over 50 dialects and sublanguages and what have you. So it's an area of truly immense linguistic diversity. And as an archaeologist, I went out there to see whether I could try to figure out why that would be the case on one island, which is big, but not that big. This is back when I was a child, working in the field. That's what anthropologists like to do. And I tried to map the various variables of the environment, including topography and population size in various places. And I then tried to extract from that. And this was, I'm very impressed, by the way, with Marco and others. I mean, I like mathematical models as long as we sort of see them as just sort of ways of trying to put something on the table. These are my early versions of trying to do what I've heard today. In this case, believe it or not, we didn't have computers. We had punch cards. You had to take them to a computer center. You couldn't sit at your desk and do any of that. And I mean, I brought the first mainframe computer into Field Museum in the 1970s. So this was long before that. So I had to use this two-dimensional approach. And I also wanted to talk about relations or whether it would be possible to predict how connected, not how admixed, but how connected people might be by developing a kind of graphic approach, which this is first, second, and third nearest neighbors. That's the rule of how you make these lines. But I realized at that time, and this was very early in the 70s, that if I called it just that, people wouldn't go, oh, wow. So I decided instead I would call it the first, second, and third proximal point analysis, which I am glad to say in archaeology, particularly in Europe, is now known as a PPA. But the basic variable here, or the basic contingency, is simply spatial distance, first, second, and third degree of nearness. And from that, I tried, and this is in the 1970s, I tried to develop something called human biogeography and something called sort of geographic system. Now, that was back in the days when systems were really of the rage. But one of the problems about system is that, you know, the implication is that what is at one point in time is going to happen again, sort of systematically over and over again. And I think we all know enough about history to know that history is far more complex and far less predictable than most systems would be. But nonetheless, I wanted to sort of indicate how different kinds of contingencies or variables have to be taken into account. And we've been heard already in these talks, you have to take a lot into account before you even begin to approach a real understanding of what you're looking at. Lately, I've tried to sort of change that, and my thinking has changed. I still don't know what to call what in the earlier version I called a population. I don't know what a population is. And I don't know what to call it. I do know that not everybody is related to everybody else or deals with everybody else, but I have no idea what we should call it, just so we can talk about it. But nonetheless, I think you can see that I love human biogeography. More recently, on the north coast of New Guinea, I also went not simply because it was a linguistically astonishingly diverse place on Earth, but the center of most linguistic diversity on the great island of New Guinea. I think Greenland is now becoming more island-like as global warming sort of melts the ice. But this is either the first or the second largest island in the world. We went to the north coast of New Guinea to study how people integrated or dealt with one another, because it is the center of linguistic diversity on the island of New Guinea. That wasn't the only reason we went there. We wanted to also look at the material culture collections we have at the Field Museum. I mean, it was astonishing to me because this was a major battlefield during the Second World War, that after the war, people had gone back to their old village locations and they were doing what they had been doing before the war. And this is a fish weir, which I love this picture. This received a lot of local enthusiasm because they were jealous. Anthropologists working in New Guinea had always gone to the highlands on the assumption that the highlands would be pure old time. And if you were down on the coast, it had been affected by colonialism too much to be worth study. And so they were delighted to actually have anthropologists come along and want to study them as opposed to the people in the highlands. And we did that, and we looked at language and we looked at material culture, and all of this has been published, so I'm not going to say too much. What we realized that what we were dealing with were different degrees of connectivity or relationships, in this case, spatial and cultural and linguistic. And what really shocked a lot of people was that when you looked at linguistic diversity, it really has almost no correlation with what people are actually dealing with and doing with one another in this part of the world, which is, again, I repeat, linguistically the hot center of diversity in New Guinea. And from this, I've concluded, and not everybody likes it, that you really can't take language as a map of history. Doesn't mean you shouldn't pay attention to it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't model it, but it's only one possible way of thinking about what actually happened in history. So why is this important? Well, if you know anything about the Pacific, you know there's supposed to have been two migrations. One was the New Guineans 40, 50, 60, 65, 70,000 years ago, soon after our species allegedly left Africa. And then another race, and I use that word specifically because it is a colonialist term, and we're still dealing in the Pacific with colonialist models of biogeography, another one called the Polynesians. And so there were supposed to be two migrations out into the Pacific. The International Biogeography Society has given Jared Diamond an award a long time ago for his work in biogeography, and I'm sure he deserved it. But when it comes to talking about human, biological, cultural, and social, and what have you, diversity in this part of the world, the idea that somehow the ancestors of the Polynesians today took an express train to get to Polynesia from somewhere in China or Taiwan is an idea that I just find breathtakingly absurd. Another version of the same model is it's a prettier, cleaner version. I call it the pinball model of Polynesian prehistory, that somehow there was a group of people that were going to be the Polynesians, racially stayed together and moved as such, and went off, split off and went in different directions, still maintaining that racial identity until they finally got to where they ultimately belonged. And again, I just find that it's colonialist and it is racist, and it as a biogeographer and as someone interested in explanations, it just strikes me amazingly that anybody would believe that was how the world works. The most recent example of this particularly egregious form of over-interpreting sort of very little data is some genetic information that shows that people down in Vanuatu might have some genetic traits from people in Taiwan, not even asking why the people in Taiwan might have that trait. And even that's up for grabs when you look at the specific alleles and so forth. Even that's up for grabs, but then coming out with a very simple model of human biogeography that also reinforces our racial and colonialist models of the Pacific. So instead of a model like an express train, and this is not a particularly good example, I think if you're going to model 2,000 years of history, you can't pretend that somebody some group of people started at A and stayed together as such until you got to B. You need to model the whole process by which people might move out. And you need to also be very careful when you use the word process, because I've written about this. Processes implies that even their movement out was somehow orchestrated by a single motivation or a single theme. And that assumption also needs to be challenged. But at least you have to conceive that you're getting, in a sense, different human stories depending on where you are. And you also need to test what I call the plausibility of your arguments with what we already know. And it isn't just there's no mathematical way I think you can talk about plausibility except what we already know as human beings. But this kind of distinction, I think, is very important. Is what you're arguing 2,000 years from Taiwan to Vanuatu even probable? We've tested that. We're looking at that. You can do that in various ways. I'm not going to try to describe it. I could present some of our mathematical models and some of our formal models, but all I want to say is when you do that, it really turns out that the key descriptor, that probably the key variable is whether or not people had the right kind of canoe, whether they even could. And then you have the issue of, can we pin down why? So if you look at that, and then you also look at linguistic diversity, not just in the island of Bougainville or even in New Guinea, but in this entire part of the world. And I love they included the French over there on the extreme left as sort of the out group. I like that. And you look at that, you realize that there is some geographic patterning to linguistic diversity. But when you then ask by specific traits, whether that pattern gives you a simple answer to racial migrations, you realize the traits that are said to be the markers of one migration, in fact, you cannot make that distinction. So one of the things I'm preaching these days, and I very much feel that we all need to make this simple change. We not only need to stop using the word race, which I think we now sort of realize is a no-no word. I think we use the word people. But I also think we need to stop talking about populations as if they're not defined groups, as if they're actual real groups, and instead just use the word sample. And then I think, again, this is because I like to think of myself as a biogeographer. You need to talk about not admixture, but about, for example, geographic mobility and social mobility. So I've written a number of books in the last few years that may surprise you if I'm a biogeographer and an anthropologist and so forth. One of them is about friendship, and one of them is about how the human mind works. If you made any sense at all in what I've been saying, you can see that I need to take what we know about how people socially deal with one another. We need to take into account what we as animals are capable and are likely to do. And if you do that and you add it together, here's our new book. I hope to be able to say the name of a publisher fairly soon, but we're trying to take what we've been doing in the last decade, really, and put together a handbook for students that we hope will be open access on the web to sort of help them sort of try to define testable models. And there we are. By the way, if you wanted to have some good reasons for why to do biogeography and human biogeography, there's a wonderful website called the Slogan Generator, which gives you sort of reasons to sort of, at the next cocktail party, say why you're doing what you're doing. I particularly like human biogeography, makes you sexy myself.
So thanks a lot, John, for your great talk. Yeah, human biogeography, we build smiles. Why not? Okay, great tagline for the next. So maybe Stephanie, she's the next speaker, and it's there very early in the morning, but I saw she's already here, so maybe she can already start her screen. And in the meanwhile, if there's a question for John, please feel free to ask a question. There's time for one question.
Yeah, I've been here just now I'm much more bright-eyed and bushy-tailed now that it is the glorious hour of 8 in the morning. I thank you very much for inviting me to give one of the Humboldt lectures, and thank you very much also for letting me go last so that I could be a little bit more awake. I've enjoyed all of the talks so far, and I feel like the work I'll be presenting really does kind of wrap up some of the ideas that John and Fernando both brought forward, and I think will lead to a good discussion. So I'm an assistant professor of socio-environmental modeling at Utah State University and also a fellow at the Santa Fe Institute. I'm a person who holds a PhD from the United States in anthropology and from France in essentially an environmental science department. So I try and bring these two ideas together, the human place in ecosystems in the past, as a way for understanding the present and the future. I do all these other things. I'm happy to talk about any of these other things, but a lot of my research brings together excavation, ethnographic work, and computer modeling. And so today, the work I'll be talking about really looks at these kinds of ideas, computer modeling that is grounded in the kinds of things that John was talking about. How do we understand not only how people moved, but what were their lived experiences when they were there? My computer just froze, and so let's see. All right, sorry guys.
No worries.
I'm gonna have to force quit.
It's also early in the morning for the computer.
Apparently. You can see that my mouse isn't even doing anything. So this is a highly awkward way to start everything.
Oh, don't worry. Do you want to?
Okay. I am super duper excited about talking about this. So I have this paper that came out back in May, and that's what my primary presentation is going to be about today. You get to watch me as I try and multitask and keep your attention while I open Keynote. One of the, I think, benefits of having this pandemic is that we can bring together people from across the way. That is what we're experiencing today. And sure, we have little technical difficulties, but we can get there. You can still see my force quit applications, yes? Hold on. All right, so when I'm not troubleshooting the Zoom presentation share, I'm doing, my primary work is looking at network modeling and agent-based modeling. Today, I'm going to be talking kind of about network modeling and how we can use flow models, where we're looking at where people start from and where they go. And so I'm not talking about an express train across Polynesia, but we are talking about the ways that people were able to move in the past and how we can learn from those connections across the past today. I am going to do a shameless plug that for those of you who are interested in computational modeling and have a bent toward understanding the past, I have a very recent textbook out with the Santa Fe Institute Press. It is, I believe, €9. In the Netherlands, you have to order through German Amazon because of their print-on-demand services. But you can also, through the Santa Fe Institute Press, get a completely open access online version of this. And so if any of these ideas of connecting people across space and time are interesting to you, this is the first textbook that we know of that looks at the archaeological record and agent-based modeling. So shameless plug. Now let's talk about the research. I am not sure that this is going to work very well today. It's just going to keep quitting on me, apparently. So I'm going to try this again, and I've never had this happen before. I'm very sorry. that this is happening, I'm going to quit every other thing that is on my computer, and then we'll go from there. So this paper came out in May, and it's the accumulation of 5 years of work of trying to look at the ways that people moved into and across Sahul and Australia. This work was kind of came about because of an interest that I had in, all right, share screen again. You might just have to look at my screen like this and we'll see if this works. Because I'm not sure why it is quitting out, but now you can see where we're going. So we're going to be looking at modeling the incredible deep past of Australia. So looking at the ways that people moved into Australia, Papua New Guinea, and Tasmania in the last glacial maximum. So it's a little debatable about when people arrived, but these kinds of models can be useful for looking at future scenarios. And so when we think about this deep past of when people first came into the continent, we have the continent of Sahul, which you can see here, a representation of this, where you can see New Guinea on the top here with the white outline. You can see Australia down here. And because so much water was captured in global sea ice, we ended up with a much larger continent that was visible at the time. But you can see that there are still spots where we don't have a contiguous landmass. But we do know, of course, that people arrived in this area many thousands of years ago. So people have been thinking about this question of how did people get to Sahul for a very long time. This work, of course, interdigitates with a lot of the work that John Terrell has been working on and talked about today. And there's even a board game, the game of Stone Age colonization, that looks at how the peopling happened. So this question has been talked about for a very long amount of time. The 50s, Birdsell suggested kind of a scatter process. People arrived on the coast and then just had this Benny Hill-like explosion across the continent. Bowdler suggested that people kind of hugged the coastlines. And then Horton and Tinsdale kind of suggested hugging the woodlands in the north and then expanding out. So we know that people got there. We just don't know how. And this is something we're still debating. So if we look at these processes, this is like, so Fernando, even archaeologists just do arrows across a map, which is why your comment made me laugh so much. We have these ideas of where people got and how they radiated through, but a lot of the data is not there. So the genetic data, the archaeological data, we have spots on the map. So we don't have good baseline data to test the hypothesis. These kinds of models are incredibly computationally expensive to run, and it's only been recent that we've been able to start looking at these models. And so we can get these little data points, but how do you connect them together? How do you connect the linguistic evidence, the trade evidence? How do you even link that when we have modern data and people are suggesting that people arrived in Sahul 70,000 years ago? That's a very long time, and that's a lot of time for a culture to change. Most of these models are verbal and conceptual models, such as on the right, which are incredibly valid and useful for thinking about these things. But we were interested in testing these kinds of ideas. So a very large group of us came together at the Santa Fe Institute. So obviously that's me, with a bunch of Australians who had never seen this much amount of snow come out of nowhere, which is why I love this picture. So we have Michael Bird and Sean Olm. Sean Olm being an archaeologist, Michael Bird being a geographer, Devin White, who's trained in archaeology but works for the United States National Labs. And then we have two ecologists, Corey Bradshaw and Fred Saltre. And so all of us are interested in these questions. So can we bring our mutual expertise together to look at these ideas of migration into Australia? So it's a simple problem, but it's very computationally complex. In other areas, there are flow models and path models that have been used to look at migration across landscapes. Anytime you get a guidebook for looking at hiking, you get an idea of a flow model because they're calculating how difficult it will be to go across certain terrain. So in the Netherlands, the difficulty would be walking through generally wet areas. There's not a lot of high topography in the Netherlands. But then you go to, let's say, Scotland, and you're going to have a different kind of computational complexity for going over the hills and through the marshy areas. But even though these are very simplistic, and they generally use what is known as Tobler's hiking function, where you look at kind of the effort that you'll have for going upslope or across a flat slope, these kind of give you these radiating paths. Michael Fraschetti's work in 2017 looked at more of a flow model where you essentially pour water across the landscape and look at where it would go to anticipate where people would go, where would be the easiest place to walk. So Devin White, who's at the Sandia National Lab, developed about 10, 15 years ago, this from everywhere to everywhere workflow. So instead of looking at one point to another point, how costly is it to get from this point to that point? He's looking at how costly is it to move everywhere on the landscape. His original work was looking at trade routes in Oaxaca, but I've always been interested in, can we look at the peopling of an entire continent with an idea of this from everywhere to everywhere? So within this model, we're going to see a lot of equations. It's very early in the morning for me for equations. It may be too late in the day for you for equations, but just to glance over this. So we do use Tobler's hiking function. So how costly, how fast is it for you to move on a slope? Can you walk up the hills? I have mountains right outside my window here in Utah. What is that going to look like? But then how difficult is the hiking? So the US government, US Army has developed a lot of these kinds of equations for trying to look at moving troops across various places. And they can be very useful for a computational model because computational models need to be fairly simple to begin with. But then once you have the very simple bits, then you can add more complexity on top. So our first null model is looking at just the complexity of moving across all of Sahul. So we have uphill and downhill equations. So downhill does give a certain stress on the body, on your knees, on your ankles. And so we have different equations for that. How much would you expend going between two different cells? And what is the expenditure difference among men, women, children? What if you're carrying something? What if it's hot? You know, we can put all of these things into this kind of model, which then gives us a baseline model of what movement across an entire surface would look like. So here is what it looks like. So we're doing this really from every single cell on the landscape. We looked at, I mean, you can go down to, you know, within centimeters, which doesn't make a lot of sense for a human, but you look at the human travel of a kilometer or a meter or whatever. So in this example, we have these 20 different red embarkation and destination points, and we calculate all paths between them. So you can see a digital elevation model below those, just a random one. We sample among all of them. There are actually little white lines connecting every single one of those that you can see in this middle bit here. And then we look at the most traveled. So we run this model many, many times, and we say, how frequently would a traveler choose this path? So a traveler can choose any path, but they're going to have different reasons for choosing different paths. Maybe they want to go from this upper left to this lower right as quickly as possible. Or maybe they're interested in something. There's this high landform over here. Maybe they want to be pulled toward that high landform or go away from it. And so that puts that weight in for how often someone will travel. So that's the basic idea between our from everywhere to everywhere models. So as I said, this is the base. I spent time in the Western Desert of Australia working with Mardu Aboriginal foragers. Here you can see Nialanka Taylor teaching me how to properly kill a goanna lizard. But during these forays, so this was before we even started this project, I noticed that as we were walking around, Nialanka had a very and all the other women had these rules for how to not get lost. The Western Desert is fairly flat, but there are rocky ridges. And so they would use the horizon to orient themselves as they're walking through a landscape that I, as a stranger to this landscape, thought looked very similar. Now they have, nothing looks similar to them. They know all of this. They've learned all of this. And until the 1960s, they lived very traditional nomadic foraging lifeways. So the rules that Milanka told me for how to move across the Western Desert are orienting yourself on the horizon, trying to camp at water nightly. So they know where all the fresh water is. There's a lot of rock holes where you have little springs that come up, and there is seasonal water throughout the area. They try to carry about 10 kilograms of water on these forays. And women are generally leading the pack because they're keeping children and the elderly together. And so these kinds of rules we can then use along with Binford's constructing frames of reference to get an idea of how people may choose to keep their groups together as they move. Now, as John brought up in his talk, to talk about these pinball ways of people moving through landscapes and keeping their group together until they radiate out after a couple thousand years is kind of disingenuous. But as a scientist, we have to use the data that we have. And so we can use these baseline ideas of what it takes for a human to move across the landscape. And then we can use these ideas from a living culture within that landscape, plus a global survey of cultures. Do people do this kind of thing? What does it cost in terms of caloric costliness to move across a landscape? And what we're looking at is the routes. We're not looking at the rate of expansion yet, but we're looking at where people move through. So to do this, we needed new data layers. So we created the first ever fine resolution digital elevation model for 40 to 70,000 years ago of all of Sahul. So Australia, New Guinea, Tasmania connected in this. And this is fully and freely available for any of your research that you may need. So we essentially drained the oceans and we stitched all this together to create a new digital elevation model of the continent. So remember, I said that people like to look to the edges. So we created a visual prominence layer for all of Sahul. So what this does is essentially put a little agent on the ground and you say, what do you see when you're down here? And we create this kind of weighting layer throughout the entire continent, this moving weighting layer of what is the visibility where you are? What is the visibility when you're on top of a hill versus at the bottom? Like I said, Australia is terribly flat, but we end up with some of these areas that you can see in yellow that are the higher areas, and then the blue are the lower areas. So the reason we have this is as you're moving through a continent, do things on the horizon help orient you? Do they pull you to a certain way? But they're not necessarily pulling you all the way there. They're just kind of helping you to orient yourself. I have used this myself when I'm hiking in unfamiliar terrain. If my maps are not terribly reliable, it can be really useful to be able to look and say, okay, I'm going to keep that mountain on the horizon while I walk this direction. That way I know where I'm going. And then we looked at rivers and arroyos going all the way to the coastlines, and we extended them for our digital elevation model. So this is actually creating a flow model of extant rivers and arroyos, and then building them toward the coast. And this gives something for our computational people to use in their travels. So then we have a combination of variables and weightings to get the paths out with this from everywhere to everywhere model, looking at every single cell. We did kilometer by kilometer within all of Sahul. So how do people move through the entire landscape? Showing tables and talks is always terrible, but this gives you an idea of the different kinds of weightings that we use. So coastline to a grid over all of Sahul, water to different water sources. What are their beginning and end points? We ended up using a supercomputer at the Sandia National Lab in a non-interference basis to create these models. We ended up with 125 billion paths that we created over the course of all of the models, which, to give you an idea, most of these kinds of simulations do maybe 100 because they are computationally expensive. The reason we were able to do it this way is because of this supercomputer and because computational techniques have gotten so much better, but it also gives us a much better idea of where the most frequently chosen paths would be. So once the paths were acquired, we then compared against a data set of old archaeological sites. So this is greater than actually 35,000-year-old sites. And we put these all together. So this is a new data set. Again, everything with this is open source and open access. You can use any of it. And then we had to create our own statistics because what we have is a network when we create these paths that people are walking on. And we had to be able to compare those networks to a completely spatially randomization of archaeological data to be able to ensure the paths make sense. So you could use the archaeological data points as an input for this model, but we wanted to test whether our essentially null models of travel put in with actual physiological characteristics of travelers and needs of travelers and these reasons for orienting would in fact connect with any of these old archaeological data sets. So what we ended up with, we have these most chosen pathways. So again, to remind you, there are billions of paths in here. The darker looking and red to yellow paths are the paths that are most frequently chosen. So our digital travelers, every time they go through a pixel, that pixel has a little counter and it says, okay, 1 went through here, 2 went through here, 3 went through here, right? And so then we're able to choose those that are most chosen, and then we can compare those against the archaeological data set. And so we end up with probabilities, path chosen probabilities, and then we report those in that paper. So what this tells us, with this kind of computational technique, people maximizing their ability to get water, do wayfinding in topography, these actually did correspond best with our archaeological data. When we removed these, this did not correspond well at all. So our goodness of fit test just failed at all. So with 125 billion paths, we have some idea of where people went. Some sites we see are not near superhighways, and you can see Fernando, I added a caption just for you on this this image here. So we have some sites that correspond to these superhighways, but some sites that do not. So if we look here, we can see that there are these very large swaths, especially through the Western Desert, where we haven't found archaeology. Preservation is incredibly poor. So it could mean a couple of things. People didn't go there and our model is crap, which is, you know, as a modeler, you're used to figuring that out. Or it could mean that these are good places for prospection. A lot of work hasn't been done out here. Where I work is essentially in here, in this big green spot. But if we want to look at some of these paths, that could provide a concordance. So remember, we're looking at the most null model here, the most basic. There are, of course, stories from Aboriginal cultures that link with some of our pathways. And when I've presented this work with the people who I lived with in the Western Desert, they pointed out some of these that link to some of their stories of like Dreamtime pathways of the Seven Sisters, for example. And one of the things that this is interesting, and I think it shows, is that I think a lot of people don't think about people in the past as being highly connected, but people were. And we definitely see trade of things like native tobacco, patchouli, or greenstone going among these different areas. And this work can show a potential way of the stigmergic effects of pathways forming. As people move into a new landscape, they're going to orient themselves and create these spaces that then they're going to keep using and keep using. So the early people of Sahul we think, used a set of fundamental rules associated with this physiological capacity, distribution of fresh water, and attraction to landscape features to move themselves throughout the landscape. We call them superhighways. That's just modern jargon. They did not call them superhighways. It's just how we suggest that some of these were used so frequently. These things show up very deeply on the landscape. And some of them you can actually even see some indentations where people have traveled a lot when you go out there. There are implications for biodiversity. So Fred Saltre's work has looked at extinction of megafauna and how people came in. And there's definitely a relationship between when people show up and when megafauna leave. And this is highly debated, but it's an interesting correlation. And so looking at the efficient ways that people could move through essentially could have implications for thinking about megafauna collapse. As I mentioned before, this can tell us routes, but not rates. So one of the things we're working on is a cellular automata model Corey Bradshaw has been working on with these superhighways, with these models. So we have this bone structure. And then I recently received a large grant from the Australian national government to look at the connections of Aboriginal peoples in the Holocene and up to today. So looking at these trade routes, looking at stock routes of the early European explorers, and looking at how languages connect. So this is really that very basic model that we can then build on to look at these connections. So why does this matter? Well, it matters for the history and the culture of Australia, but it also matters for understanding the future. So we're looking at how people move on their feet in novel landscapes to get from one place to another. This work also shows this deep feedback between the health of the ecosystem and the health of people. So how do people move through landscapes with enough water? How do they not? And these kinds of approaches, the from everywhere to everywhere model, have been used for looking at other kinds of migrations. Using it as at a continental scale here for the expansion of the coastline for Sahul, and then looking at as the coastline drowns into the Holocene, is going to be incredibly important for understanding the migrations of people from the coast. I am out of time, so I want to thank all of my collaborators who have worked on many different parts of this, my funders, and open it up for questions and probably just discussion with everyone at this point. So thank you, and I apologize for the technical difficulties this morning. How awkward.
Wow, thanks a lot, Stephanie. Really fascinating stuff. Great. Yeah, give Stephanie a warm applause. Are there maybe questions from the audience? We have maybe 5 minutes or so for questions. So please, you either put it in the chat if you're comfortable with that, or you can unmute. Yeah,
Fernando, just go.
I think it was a wonderful, wonderful talk. I'm glad archaeologists are also doing this as well. I guess I have a ton of questions. One of them is like, how feasible do you think this would be to do for other regions of the world? I mean, I'm sure you've put seems like you've put a ton of resources just for this particular question of Australian expansion. And there's probably very similar questions for other types of occupations. And I guess the added complexity is that I guess most of Australia was empty of humans, and so there's less. I guess there's less variables to account for.
There definitely are, and that was definitely an attraction, is because it's a relatively empty landscape. So they're not encountering other peoples that we know of, and so it reduces complexity. In terms of being able to do this elsewhere, we've, of course, since the paper's been published, been approached by a lot of people who are very excited for this to happen where they are. It is computationally expensive. And so having access to a US government supercomputer is very helpful for doing this at a continental scale. Not necessary, but incredibly helpful. And I think we are excited about being able to use this elsewhere. So looking at the Numic expansion, for example, would be a really interesting additional question using these from everywhere to everywhere approaches. But I think the fact that we've published this means that there will be other groups who do this either with us or take the kind of how-to that we have in our supplemental material and do it with their own. But that's what I'm most excited about and why we do this open access, is so that this can be another piece in the tool set that can help advance science.
Great, great. Thanks a lot. I also have a question. You mentioned you have included three variables or contingencies, as John would say. So landscape features, physiology, and freshwater distance to freshwater. So do you have any idea about if I think back about Marco's presentation that we started with, about the relative contribution of these different variables over space and perhaps also over time?
Yeah, so 70,000 years ago, it's very difficult to put in kind of social variables that would have an effect. So we do have different kinds of weighting that we allow these things to have. And I'm trying to think about how to respond exactly to this in a precise way. We did look, so we ran this model a lot before we ran it for the whole 125 billion for the publication. And so we didn't put completely equal weighting in looking at, you know, a mountain versus finding water, but these things kind of vary. You know, some places you're not going to have water while you're walking, but you're going to have a mountain. And so that's going to have much more of an impact. And so we wrote something into the simulation to enable different weightings. And so if you're next to a river and there's a mountain, they're going to have more or less equal-ish rating. But then as you're wandering, they're going to kind of fluctuate. It's one way to do it. There are, of course, many ways to do it. But this, we felt, because this is the nullest of the null models, because it's so deep time, we felt that this was the best way so that we're not making the decisions. The computer is making the most parsimonious decisions as it goes along. And remember, we're also running these without these layers on it. So that's why we have so many. So we'll run some that are just water. We'll run some that are just, you know, landscape features. We'll run some that have water and landscape features. We'll run, you know, and so that's one of the ways that we make sure that there aren't confounding effects with the variables.
Okay, great. Thanks. There's a question in the chat. Thank you for your interesting presentation. Have similar studies have ever been done focused on similarly isolated areas such as Japan, New Zealand, or for example, Madagascar?
So I can point to, so if we're looking at path models, there has been interesting maritime path modeling in the Caribbean by Dr. Emma Slayton, who is at Carnegie Mellon. She did her PhD at Leiden, and her work was all about looking at maritime path modeling. I do not know of a very recent maritime path model for Polynesia, Micronesia, Melanesia. There is very good path modeling of looking at how people used watercraft to get from Sundaland to Sahul. But I think this is a very open thing. And one of the reasons is it is so computationally expensive that people could only start doing it recently. So my answer is sort of yes, but also Stanislav, you should do that research.
Great. Many opportunities to expand on this in other regions. Great. Okay, maybe if there's a last question to wrap up, then, and otherwise I think because of the time, it's also good to close. So,
I'm going to put my email address in the side in case anyone's interested in contacting me. And I'm happy to chat about any and all of these things.
Okay, so then maybe one more warm applause to all of the speakers. Thanks a lot, Fernando, Stephanie, Marco, and John. It was great. Thank you for your time, for getting up so early, and yeah, and hope to see all of you virtually, maybe again in one of such a occasion. And it's great that we can do this now with such an international group of people in the audience and also in the speakers. So yeah, I will close here. So have a good day or good night.